I think I'm pretty close to 100% right on this, and I do think a lot of people are just straight up wrong. Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for Renaissance Periodization, and today's video is about the stiff-legged deadlift versus the Romanian deadlift, and the fact that this is an illusory dichotomy. In fact, these are basically, no, they are the same thing. Controversial, I know. And I know because there are tons of other influencers, most of them very, very sharp and making great videos, that have made entire videos talking about what the difference is between an SLDL and an RDL, a stiff-legged deadlift, and a Romanian deadlift. And what I'm going to tell you is going to be potentially controversial, but I think I'm pretty close to 100% right on this, and don't worry, I'll support it, even with sources, that actually it's the same thing. Weird. And I do think a lot of people are just straight up wrong. With all due respect, I've been wrong many times in my life. Here we go. Maybe this is one of them. Let's find out. What is an RDL? I think it's an SLDL. SLDL, stiff-legged deadlift. And it is an SLDL as described to the attendees of a weightlifting seminar in San Francisco in 1990 by the Romanian lifter Nicu Vlad and his coach Dragomir Kiraslan. That's my best pronunciation of that. I am not Romanian, but close, close. Man, Romanians have the sweetest names. I would pay good money to have my name be Dragomir. That's fucking awesome. You know that guy's in your weight class, you're fucking losing. In any case, this Romanian deadlift was actually named by US Olympic coach at the time, Jim Schmitz, as the Romanian deadlift because he asked, during training, these folks were, Nico was doing the stiff-legged deadlift, and they asked him, hey, what is that movement? What do you call that? And they didn't really know. They said, deadlift, it is a deadlift, and they couldn't really explain it, so it's, Romanian deadlift. And so Jim Schmitz named it right there. How do I know this? It is well described by Jim Schmitz himself in the Ironmind article that is linked right over here. Maybe Scott will drop this link in the description as well, but you can just look at it. It's written up, and just Google it. It comes up really quick. By the way, for serious strength athletes, Ironmind magazine is the fucking bee's knees. It is unbelievable. I used to read it literally 20 years ago, and it was just great, is great, amazing. Can't recommend it more than I already have. Now, how did Jim Schmitz himself, and this is directly from Ironmind, directly his quote, describe the lift, okay? He said, and I'll just read, so forgive me for not looking at the camera. You grab the bar with your clean grip, pull the bar to the tops of your thighs, but don't complete the lift. That is, don't lock out your back. The knees are not locked out, the chest is out, the back is flat, and then you then lower the bar to about 2 inches from the platform, keeping your back perfectly flat or arched, and your knees slightly flexed. Then you return to the almost erect position. I've been almost erect a few times. That's me, not him saying that. But it is very critical here not to fully lock the knees, then repeat. 2 very important details are, number 1, your back stays flat or arched at all times, and 2, your knees stay slightly flexed at all times. This lift is almost all low back, glutes, and hamstrings. Now, color me fucking completely crazy, but that is the stiff-legged deadlift that lots of lifters have been doing around the world for decades, even at that time in 1990. No? Well, let's find out. Again, here is Jim Schmitz. Quote, an interesting side note here is that Yoshinobu Miyake, Japan's 1964 and 1968 Olympic champion in weightlifting, was at the clinic where the Romanians were, and he said he did the same exercise back in his prime in the 1960s. I let that sink in. I'm calling them Japanese deadlifts from now on. Weird. In addition to this, my PhD chair, Dr. Mike Stone, who's one of America's best ever sports scientists, was and is, used to say, very angrily, I might add, when you called it an RDL in front of him, we used to do stiff-legged deadlifts before the Romanians visited. They did not invent that exercise. They did it like many, many other people around the world had for decades. Now, let's get into the weeds of the refined technique. Technically speaking, The RDL is a variation of the stiff-legged deadlift. It is a type of stiff-legged deadlift, which is a broader category of potential ways of doing that exercise, but it's actually the most common way of doing that exercise, and it is probably in most cases the most proper technique. The stiff-legged deadlift is designed to hit mostly the hamstrings, and RDL style, which Jim Schmitz just described for us, is exactly, or almost exactly, how most people would do it. It's nearly ideal. Now, I just said that the RDL is one type of a universe of stiff-legged deadlifts, a spectrum of ways you could do that exercise. And so some of the stuff that was said in the way to do it, like stopping a few inches from the ground, we could critique and say, aren't there different ways of doing that? Yes, and here they are. First, all stiff-legged deadlifts can vary on the degree of back arch. You can be ultra super arched in your lower back, or you can be even very rounded. Number two, they can vary in the degree of knee bend. You can have a significant amount of knee bend, or you can do, technically speaking, a stiff-legged deadlift with completely straight knees and everything in between. Number three, the degree of bar and hip travel. You can keep your hips relatively stationary and let the bar swing out really far. You can try to keep your hips stationary, this is very challenging, and keep the bar super tight to your legs. You can try to push your hips back really far as you descend and have the bar travel very far away from you as well. Or, most commonly, you have your hips travel really far back and the bar stays very close to your hips and the rest of your body. Number four, depth differences. You can finish a stiff-legged deadlift at the bottom at just around or below the knees, or generally, if you're very flexible, you can do them all the way to below the floor, which means you're standing on a platform or lifting with smaller weights, and those are deficit stiff-legged deadlifts. Number five is the grip. You can have a narrow grip or a wide grip or even a snatch grip. These are all variations on a theme of the stiff-legged deadlift, and the RDL is one subtype of the stiff-legged deadlift more generally. Okay? Now, there are a few other more minor distinctions, and I'm sure I haven't even covered all of them, but here are some other things to think about. One is the degree of eccentric control. You'll notice that RDLs, you descend relatively slowly. Hypothetically, you could do a stiff-legged deadlift where you descend more quickly. Retracted versus rounded shoulders. You could have a stiff-legged deadlift where the shoulders just hang. You could have ones where you arch and pull back your scapulae the entire time. You can choose to pause in the bottom position or not to pause. You can touch the ground or not touch the ground, and about a million other smaller changes you could make. Now, because in my humble view, probably the best use of stiff-legged deadlifts is hamstring training, let's review what the best practices are for using stiff-legged deadlifts to train your hamstrings. How would we change these variables we just talked about that could be different between different approaches to the stiff-legged deadlift to actually train our hamstrings the best? Well, here it is. First, you'll see, by the way, many of these, almost all, overlap with how an RDL is described. First, you want to have anterior pelvic tilt, which means that you have a neutral back or an arched back. Your hips are tilted up and back. That pre-stretches the hamstrings, allowing them to get into a more favorable position to be stimulated for growth. Two, you have a slight knee bend. It means you're not going to be really uncomfortable with no knee bend at all, and you can produce a loading situation for the hams without concerns for safety, so it's really good. You don't want too much of a knee bend because then you just have to move the bar a lot further to get the hamstrings actually stretched out. Number three, you want a slow descent to maximize that nasty eccentric hamstring stimulus and to stay safe. The hamstrings are a finicky muscle. Any of you guys who have ever played sports know the hamstrings like to get injured every now and again. And those are really almost always really nasty injuries you don't want. They're pulls, they're this, they're that. You want to go nice and slow because you lose nothing going slow and you gain an extra margin of safety and even probably a bit of stimulus as well. Another advantage to going slow on the stiff-legged deadlift is your knees and hips tend to go off track because they counteract each other. If you go slow, you can always reinforce that you're still using your hamstrings and that they're being pulled apart painfully. If you go quickly, you could do a thing where you do a rep, you come back up and you're like, fuck, I bent my knees too much. But if you're going slowly, you can auto-adjust, make micro adjustments, pushing your knees back, keeping them forward, back and forward to keep the right amount of tension on your hamstrings. Number four, you want to descend deep enough to painfully stretch the hamstrings. which is where that advice for stop 2 inches above probably isn't the best advice in the world from the RDL proponents. Because if you're really flexible in the hamstring, stopping 2 inches above the ground can be just not enough of a stretch and you don't get really sore or make a ton of progress. But if you're in that case, you would want to do some deficit work and really go below the floor, so to speak. But if you have very poor flexibility in the hamstrings, then you'd have to round your back a shitload in order to get 2 inches above the ground. Once you round your back, your pelvis tilts into posterior tilt. It takes tension off of the hamstrings, and then it's just not much of a hamstring exercise anymore. So really what you need to do is the height. Where you go to is the most auto-regulated part of the stiff-legged deadlift, and you go until you feel a deep, painful stretch in the hamstrings, not much further than that, and definitely don't stop until you feel that deep, painful stretch. Let me tell you guys about the RP Hypertrophy app. With over 28 preset programs already in the app, you can choose to make your own, you can modify an existing program, or you can just run the programs exactly as they were written by me personally. This app programs everything for you. Exercises, weights, sets, reps, frequency, the whole thing. After every single workout on every single week, the app adjusts to your unique parameters with every single input. We have over 250 exercises in the app with detailed video tutorial links to every single one. You never have to be confused about technique or form ever again. I'm guessing right now you're pretty interested in the app? Download the RP Hypertrophy app today. So, to wrap this up, if someone asks you, do you like SLDLs or RDLs, bro? What do you think about RDL versus SLDL? It's tantamount to asking someone, do you like fettuccine Alfredo or the kind of fettuccine Alfredo they make at most Italian restaurants? What? It's kind of the same thing. The RDL is the most common and basically the most effective type of stiff-legged deadlift for training hamstrings. So it's just kind of damn near the same thing. Or you could think about it as a stiff-legged deadlift is a very large circle, and an RDL is a also large, just slightly smaller circle that is entirely enveloped by that large circle. Trying to do a stiff-legged deadlift that is also not cataloged as an RDL usually means you're not training the hamstrings anymore, and it's just not really clear what it is you're doing. You can do very bent knee, rounded back, stiff-legged deadlift, but really, if we're putting a fine point in it, that's just a fucking deadlift. So again, RDL and SLDL is almost exactly the same thing, and in fact, the RDL is entirely encompassed by the stiff-legged deadlift category. Instead of asking, do you prefer the RDL or SLDL? And also, a lot of people don't know what these two things mean, so they'll just give you wrong answers. They think an RDL is this, where it's really not this. It's much more clear to ask things if you want to know how a person trains and what they do and want to try to copy them a little bit to get some similar results. Ask them things like this. Do you like to pause at the bottom of your stiff-legged deadlifts or RDLs? I don't care which one you use. I'm not a person that gets pissed if you use RDL. It's totally fine. The Romanians are sweet. How much do you like to pause at the bottom, or do you like to pause at the bottom? How much knee bend do you prefer? Very, very straight knees or somewhat more bent knees? How wide do you like your grip to be? Questions like that, questions that answer where on all of those margins do you prefer to do stiff-legged deadlifts? And actually, there's no one correct answer, because you can use slightly different approaches as new variations. Snatch grip stiff-legged deadlifts, conventional grip stiff-legged deadlifts, stiff-legged deadlifts where you push your butt really far back but bend your knees a little more, ones in which you basically almost bend your knees not at all but you keep your butt relatively stable. Those are all totally fine as long as they are doing the job of safely and effectively loading your hamstrings at a stretch. That's the exercise feature that we really, really want. And I think it's one of the reasons why the Romanians didn't like to do the lockout portion is because that top end really just doesn't offer a whole lot of stimulus. And if you get almost all the way up to the top, you don't have to re-enter anterior pelvic tilt. You're already in it. You can simply go right back into the movement, and it ends up being a loaded partial. And those are showing in literature to be very effective. Why are we saying just ask for variations? Because there is not this contentious battle between SLDL and RDL. The RDL is just a well-executed version of a very common type of stiff-legged deadlift, which means most physique folks will do something and should do something that looks like an RDL. And if your stiff-legged deadlift looks very different than an RDL that Olympic weightlifter is doing, there's more of a chance you're doing it wrong than you're just doing something clever that is not encompassed by the RDL category. Folks, I know this is going to have a lot of comments. I'll see you in the comments. If you like the video, please like it. If you hate it, just like it anyway. I want to be your friend. Please, I need likes. I count all the likes, and if I get 1,000 likes on a video, I buy myself a cookie and I eat it watching the likes go up. If you like this kind of nerdy stuff, we'll see you in our members area that costs more money because I need Lamborghinis desperately, but there's extra videos there every week for nerd stuff like this. And if you want help with your stiff-legged deadlift or RDL technique, come join us in the Team Full ROM forum. We'll analyze your technique. We'll make it better over time. We'll give you a ton of programs and a ton of interaction and questions answered every week and all that good stuff. That's all in the description, and I'll see you guys next time.